Well, hello and welcome to another Tyrrell's Classic Workshop. We're looking at the Lotus Esprit this time. We did a poll a few weeks ago on some cars that we had in the workshop. The Mini 1, or Minis, we've done that already. And this car was second, and the DeLorean was third. Now, the DeLorean video is coming along soon, but I really have been wanting to do a video about an Esprit for a long time because they're a very interesting piece of British and general motoring history. This is the Esprit as it first came out in 1975, 76. Although this is an S3 from the 1980s, they went through various changes quite early in the Esprit's life. This is the S3, as I say, it's a development, and it's sort of a refined version, very refined version compared to the early S1. But this early Esprit is a fascinating piece of kit. In the early days, it's moulded in two halves, two fiberglass halves, and Lotus used a pioneering low-pressure moulding system to mould this. And it came in the top half, one big moulding, and the bottom half, another big moulding, and the join was here. So this is where the two body sections actually they had a flange sticking out on the top, flange sticking out on the bottom. They bonded them together and then ground them down and put this black rubbing strip over the top. And that was how you made your Lotus Esprit, with a metal chassis underneath. It was quite the adventure for Lotus, this car, really, because before this, Lotus were very much in the kit car category. You had the Europa, which was a big success for them, a very nice looking car, very, very capable, very pioneering, one of the first production mid-engine cars, 1966, sort of up there with the Miura in terms of pushing the boundaries of production car technology in the 1960s. And the Europa was a runaway success. 70% of them were sold to people in the US. I mean, it was a real success. What Colin Chapman wanted to do was actually move Lotus more up market. So he got fortuitously, he met with Giorgetto Giugiaro at the 1971 motor show, and Giugiaro had designed wonderful things like the Maserati Boomerang, a fantastic bit of kit, but his style was sort of almost origami type styling, with lots of flat surfaces that you could make out of pieces of folded paper or cardboard. I'm being extremely simplistic and irreverent, but you get the idea. It's quite an angular car, this. And the result was, it was a match made in heaven, because Colin Chapman and Giorgetto Giugiaro struck a deal. Nobody knows what that deal was, but they struck a deal, and they started work on productionizing this car, which became the Esprit. They took the Europa chassis, strengthened it, cobbled it about to make a bigger car than the Europa, and then laid this fiberglass molded body over the top of it, and did a hugely rushed development program. And in 1975, the second car was made, and then they started to finally get the car into production. But one of the interesting facts about the early Esprits was they could only come in red, white, or blue. They weren't painted. The first fiberglass molded cars, which they all were. They were actually dyed. So when they injected the resin into the mold, along with the glass fiber that was laid in there, the resin was pre-impregnated with either red, white, or blue paint. Polyurethane paint, an extremely high-tech and durable paint. And the only reason they could do them in red, white, or blue was because it was leftover paint from British Airways from Concorde. So Lotus used Concorde paint to dye the resin on their very first cars. So that's why, for example, the Esprit that was used in The Spy Who Loved Me, I mean, they had a lot of white paint. So guess what? It was a white Lotus Esprit. And that went on for some time, and then eventually around about 1977, 1978, they finally were able to paint them other colours. So that's an interesting curio about the early life of the Esprit. But it was rushed into production because Lotus were a one-trick pony in the early 70s. They had another similarly constructed, one on top of the other, over a steel backbone chassis. They had the Elite, which was their only model, and they were desperately short of cash. So they rushed this into production in a lot of ways before it was fully developed. Where have we heard that story so many times before with sort of esoteric cars? And one of the major design flaws was on the rear suspension, and we're just going to take a look at that. Well, one of the things that really makes this car handle far better than the early Esprits is the fact that for the Turbo Esprit that came out in 1980, Lotus had to up their game because they were placing themselves in Ferrari 308 GTBI territory, price-wise and speed-wise. The Turbo Esprit was, for its time, a very fast car. And funnily enough, what happened previously was a bit like the Jaguar independent rear suspension I mentioned a few videos ago. This is your bottom link, which feeds into the chassis here, but the top link was actually the drive shaft. These are CV joints, but which can move in and out. That's the whole point of them, constant velocity joints. But the earlier drive shaft was fixed with a universal joint either way, and this actually held the wheel up. So in other words, that was the top link of the suspension, the drive shaft. And what happened was, this is the gearbox and engine assembly, which is rubber mounted. And what used to happen was the road bumps fed and the cornering loads fed everything into the drive shafts and into the engine and gearbox. So it would move around in the chassis, which is not ideal, really. So Lotus could get away with it for a while. The very early Esprits had a Vauxhall Opel front suspension off the Cavalier or Ascona. But as I say, for the Turbo in 1980, they did up their game. They had to drastically. And the result was that this model, the S3, got all the good bits of the Turbo without the turbo. So it's a normally aspirated, nice package with things that actually handle and work properly. And what Lotus did was put a top link here, which fed into the chassis, and that left the drive shaft free to be just a drive shaft. I mean, this is a typical example of Lotus. You know, they went for extreme lightness, but sometimes they at that time they cut corners in terms of quality, shall we say, of the final product. But on this, they went for quality. They acknowledged it was a problem, they got rid of it and put this simple top link in the suspension, and it just took all the loads off the engine and transmission, fed them into the chassis as it should do, and that's why the S3 is a gem of a car on the road. Of course, the Esprit figured very prominently in the 1977, I think, Bond film, The Spy Who Loved Me. And the story goes that Donovan McLaughlin, who was Lotus's PR guy, went to Pinewood Studios, where obviously Cubby Broccoli et al. were based, and he parked, gave a little something or other to the doorman, the gateman at Pinewood Studios, and was able to park a pre-production white Esprit at various places around the Pinewood car park, keep moving it so that everybody saw it, and they're all wondering what this space age looking car from the 90s, obviously this is mid-70s, was in the car park. And eventually the bait was taken, and Cubby Broccoli got in touch with Donovan, and the rest is history. They made the submarine Esprit in various versions, but of course it was helped massively by the fact that the body, as I said earlier, was in two mouldings. So they took an uncut bottom moulding and adapted it into the submarine. It was the most easy conversion of any production car to turn the bottom tub into a submarine with the fins sticking out the side and all those wonderful other things that were going on. Elon Musk allegedly bought the submarine Esprit the white, again white, inevitably, sometime, I think a few years ago, for about $500,000. And I think his mission was to turn it into a working submarine. But because the guys who drove the Esprit underwater were actually in full scuba gear. The car was not a working submarine. It was just a submersing thing. But one of the amusing parts was they couldn't get it off the seabed because the car is so designed for downforce. They had to really work at making the car level underwater. Well, talking about downforce, this particular car is not the turbo, it's the S3, it's the normally aspirated version, but it does have a slight kink up at the back here to help with, this really does make a big difference to the downforce at the back of the car. And this is called the gurney flap. Nothing to do with hospital beds and people rushing round. This is, it was Dan Gurney in the Indianapolis 500 in 1971, I think, if memory serves me correctly, invented the flap on the back end of the car, on the rear spoiler, which was it was an adaptation of the cam tail that Professor Cam brought in the early 1960s, but it was more pronounced than that. The turbo version of this has got a much bigger gurney flap on it, and it achieves two things. First of all, it causes downforce because the air gets pushed up, hence producing downforce. And secondly, as the air comes around here, this is a low pressure area because the air has skimmed over, and the air actually does a 180 and can help apply pressure on the back of the car in the vacuum. And this is what Professor Cam discovered in the early 60s on the likes of the Ferrari 250 GTO. So whereas if you look at cars from the 1920s or whatever, they have a long tapered tail because aerodynamicists thought that was the answer. It is not. That's why so many modern cars have got such a bluff or flat back end, because aerodynamically, easy for me to say, is actually superior this way. It's quite aerodynamically interesting, the car. The windscreen is at quite a steeply raked angle, which was part of the charm of the car and part of the dramatic sort of stunning looks of this car in the 70s was the steeply raked screen. But it took a lot of work to make this happen. Colin Chapman and Giorgetto Giugiaro spent a lot of time at Giugiaro's studio in Italy getting this right, because normally what would happen is the windscreen would be maybe raked like this in the middle, but curve round like windscreens do. So you'd end up with an A-pillar like that, which would look considerably less dramatic. So what Colin Chapman came up with the idea of was to make the windscreen almost flat. It's an almost flat windscreen. There's a bit of curvature at the top so that the A-pillars were at a similarly raked angle to the rest of the screen to give it that dramatic visual appearance. And the early Esprits were, I mean, the styling was right from the word go. I think they're a very, very pretty car. I'm going to stick my neck out and say I prefer the look of the earlier cars to the later ones. No disrespect to Peter Stevens and Julian Thompson. I had the honour of judging a concours with Julian Thompson last summer, but they did the redesign of the later Series 2 Esprit, but I love this original Giugiaro origami look. So a very interesting car, the interior styling, the instrument binnacle. This was the sort of Star Wars era, the 1970s. They came up with this sort of very space age, Space 1999 module binnacle for the instruments. But the early cars really were, because they were rushed into production so much, they were a bit rough and ready. But this car, they upped the engine capacity. They altered the valve lift and the cam timing, the valve lift up to 9.5 millimeters, about the same as a competition Ferrari in the 1960s. And they played about with the engine. They altered the rear suspension design. They increased the sound deadening in the bulkhead in the middle, and the whole thing made this a very, very refined car comparatively to the this is an S3. Compared to the S1 of the late 70s. And This is actually possibly a bit of an unsung hero. It's a cooking Esprit. It's a turbo Esprit without the turbocharger and the big rear flip on the back end. And I think this is actually quite a nice car. I quite like these. They've got bags of road holding, lots of fun. As we'll see on the road test later, the steering is delightful, but it's the turbo without the turbocharger, and actually I think this is an excellent all-round package. So let's take it for a run. Well, it's quite a while since I've driven an early-ish Esprit Series 1, and the thing about them is they do drive as well as they look. This is a sort of super refined version of the S1, which is not saying very much, but the original Esprit, depending on who you talk to, or did talk to, it was either 90% developed or 10% developed. But they had the time, like Lamborghini with the Miura, they were desperate to introduce this and get some cash flow in and some sales under their belts, and consequently the S1 was rushed into production really before it was ready. But this is a very refined version of that rear suspension modification made a big difference. It really did. And it's almost warm, this car now, because it's such a small engine. It warms up very quickly. Yeah, the thermostat has opened, the temperature gauge has settled down nicely. I'm on my usual test track, which I have to say in this car feels like the tyres are pumped up to about 310 pounds per square inch. It's very bumpy, but that's because the car's hardly been used. We're going to treat it to a new set of tyres with the owner's permission. But apart from that, it's, Pete's brought the electrics to life, which is always a challenge on a fiberglass car, because unlike a steel car, you can't just put an earth anywhere on the car. It has to be somewhere metal connected to the chassis. And on a fiberglass car, that isn't always as obvious as it seems. But Pete's done a wonderful job. The electrics are functioning perfectly, which again is quite a surprise for a 40-year-old fiberglass car. The thing that strikes me immediately about this car is the steering. It is just delicious. It's got the perfect balance of self-centering, feedback, feel of the road. You can feel the bumps with this beautiful little chunky steering wheel. It is an absolute delight. It's much better than modern electric power steering systems will ever be, because you've got an uninterrupted and undiluted feel for the road. It's just gorgeous, the steering. And the other thing is the gear change. They even joked, I think it was Mike Kimberley, or it could have been Tony Rudd, one of the other Lotus development engineers, because of the effort involved in getting the gear change from here to almost the back bumper on the car. I exaggerate a little bit, but not far off it. The gear change mechanism was very complex, and they actually said at the time, you pay £7,000 for the gear linkage and get the rest of the car for free, which is very almost Enzo Ferrari-like, really. You buy the engine and get the rest for free, but it doesn't feel as bad as it could do. The whole car, really. It's just so well planted on the road. The steering is so direct, particularly for a 1980s car. I mean, these days we're used to direct steering, but I can't get over this steering. It's just gorgeous. Good oil pressure. The engine we've carefully brought the engine to life, put a new cam belt on it. It wasn't stuck. It was free. We've made sure the piston rings are all free and everything, and it's just responded. It's been a lot of work, new fuel tanks, etc., as I mentioned earlier, to bring this car up to scratch. We've overhauled all the brakes, everything. But yeah, I'm just going to This car is never going to be a superstar performance-wise with a normally aspirated 2.2 litre engine, but let's just open it up and see what we get. It's not that bad. Just a nice acceleration experience. This is the 2.2 litre, and they actually altered when this engine first came out in the Jensen Healey in 1972. Let's face it, it was a test bed for Lotus. It was their first ever own engine, and they wanted to. Jensen very kindly came along and offered to iron out all the bugs with them. But this is the refined version. They altered the camshaft profiles and timing to give the car, to take away some of the top end power, but to give the car more torque mid-range, and that's actually what it's got. Just got a little bit of a straight here. We're down to about 2,500 revs, and the engine is very eager. Very eager. It's there's no hesitation there. It feels as ever, because of the lightness of the car, around about a ton, or it just feels so eager. This is the Chapman way of doing things, to do, you know, add lightness, just add lightness, which of course is extremely difficult to do. And in fact, the engine is getting better as it's just brought back to life. But the handling, I mean, this was it was quite an expensive car, this new. I think it was about the same price as a Porsche 911. And some people might be horrified by that and say, really? But yeah, I mean, but it is as much of a driver's car as the 911. I mean, the Turbo was a very different car, which was concurrent with this car. And the nice thing is the weighting of the controls. I always bang on about this, but the weighting of the controls is actually quite equal. So the servo brakes are not different in weighting to the accelerator. The clutch is reasonably light because, again, it's a lightweight car. It doesn't need a massive clutch to transmit huge horsepower through a heavy car. It's sweet. I have to say, the team have done a great job of bringing this car back to life. It really was quite the challenge. It's always so satisfying to do jobs like this, because this car literally hasn't run for decades. And to be able to bring it back to life like this is fantastically satisfying. This car could really do with a new set of boots, new set of tyres, and some miles putting on it, just to bring it back to life. It's interesting that around about 50% of these ended up in the US. Very large percentage. I don't know how Americans managed with the sort of hand-built nature of these cars. But anyway, manage they did. Yeah. It's a very nice car, this. Great fun. Very much a driver's car. Yeah. Ticks quite a few boxes, this. Doesn't cost the earth. Yeah. Nice car. The Lotus Esprit S3. Well, that concludes another Tyrrell's Classic Workshop video. Hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll be back with something else very soon.